The weight of the money pouch in Rose's hand felt lighter than it should, and as she stood there in the dusty Wyoming heat of white pine, watching the merchant's oily smile spread across his weathered face, she knew something was terribly wrong. Vernon McAllister had been watching the transaction from across the dirt street, where he'd tied his mule after 3 weeks in the mountains collecting pelts. His keen gray eyes, sharpened by years of survival in the wilderness, had caught the precise moment when the merchant's fingers had danced too quickly over the coins. The mountain man's broad shoulders stiffened beneath his buckskin shirt as he observed the young woman's confusion, her delicate fingers trying to recount what she'd been given in exchange for what appeared to be her late mother's jewelry. It was August of 1876, and White Pine was one of those settlements that attracted both honest folk trying to make their way and opportunists who preyed on the vulnerable. Vernon had seen enough of both types to recognize them on sight. The merchant, a portly man named Silas Green, had a reputation that Vernon had heard whispered in the saloon during his last visit to town. Nothing concrete enough to warrant the sheriff's attention, but enough to make decent people wary. The woman standing at Green's counter looked to be in her early 20s, with auburn hair pinned up beneath a simple bonnet and a dress that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. Her face held that particular kind of worry that came from counting every penny, from knowing that what little money she had needed to stretch impossibly far. Vernon's hands, calloused and strong from handling traps and axes and rifles, clenched at his sides. He was a large man, standing well over 6 feet, with muscles built from hauling game through mountain passes and chopping wood in below zero temperatures. His dark blonde hair hung past his shoulders, held back by a leather cord, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite his rugged appearance. At 28, he'd spent the better part of a decade in these mountains, preferring the company of pine trees and elk to most people. But this he couldn't ignore. He crossed the street with purposeful strides, his moccasins barely stirring the dust despite his size. The woman was speaking, her voice soft but strained. "Sir, I counted 3 necklaces, 2 brooches, and 4 rings. My mother said they were worth at least $200. This is only 40. Green's expression shifted to one of practiced patience, the kind that barely masked contempt. "Miss Langley, I understand these items have sentimental value, but their actual worth is another matter entirely. The stones are glass, not genuine. The gold plating is wearing thin. I'm being more than generous." Rose Langley's face paled. "Glass. But my father told my mother. Your father was mistaken, or perhaps the jewelry was replaced at some point. These things happen." Green began to scoop the pieces back into his velvet-lined case with an air of finality. Vernon stepped onto the wooden planks of the merchant's porch, and the boards creaked under his weight. Both Green and Rose turned at the sound. Up close, Vernon could see that Rose's eyes were a striking green, currently bright with unshed tears of frustration and disappointment. "Pardon the interruption," Vernon said, his voice a deep rumble that carried the authority of a man who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. "But I couldn't help overhearing this transaction, and I believe there might be some confusion." Green's expression soured immediately. "This is a private matter, McAllister. Move along." "Vernon McAllister," Vernon introduced himself to Rose, ignoring the merchant entirely. "I've done some trading of valuables in my time, miss. Would you mind if I took a look at those pieces?" Rose glanced between the 2 men, uncertainty flickering across her features. Vernon kept his expression open, non-threatening. He knew he looked intimidating, especially after weeks in the mountains, but he softened his eyes and kept his distance, giving her space to make her own decision. I suppose that would be all right," Rose said quietly, though Mr. Green has already evaluated them. Won't take but a moment, Vernon said, reaching for the case before Green could protest further. The merchant's hand shot out. Now see here. You have no right. Vernon's hand closed over Green's wrist, not squeezing, just holding it in place with the kind of strength that suggested any resistance would be futile. The lady said I could look. Are you refusing to let her get a second opinion on her own property? Green's face flushed red, but he released the case. Vernon picked up the first necklace, holding it up to the afternoon sunlight streaming through the shop window. He'd traded enough in various frontier towns to know quality when he saw it, and more importantly, he knew exactly what Green was attempting. This is genuine gold, Vernon said flatly, not plated. And these stones, he examined a brooch with a dark red gem. This is a real garnet. Not a large one, but genuine. He picked through the other pieces, his assessment growing darker with each item. All of this is authentic, worth easily $250, maybe $300 to the right buyer. Rose gasped softly, but he said he lied. Vernon set the jewelry down carefully and turned his full attention to Green, who had gone from red to pale in the span of seconds. Question is, how many other folks in this town has he lied to? You can't prove those are real, Green blustered. You're just a mountain man. What would you know about fine jewelry? Vernon's smile was cold. I know that before I took to trapping. I worked in a mining office in Denver where we assessed ore and minerals daily. I know that my mother came from money back east, and I grew up seeing real jewelry versus fake. And I know that Sheriff Morrison might be very interested to hear about your business practices. The threat hung in the air like smoke. White Pine was small enough that a merchant's reputation was everything, and the law, while sometimes slow, didn't take kindly to outright fraud. Green's shoulders sagged. Look, maybe I was too hasty in my evaluation. Perhaps I was mistaken about the quality, perhaps. Vernon's voice dropped to something dangerous. I was mistaken, Green corrected quickly. I can offer $150 for the lot. $275, Vernon countered, and you're getting a bargain at that price. That's outrageous. I have to make a profit. You are going to make that profit by paying $40 for $300 worth of goods. I'd say $275 is more than fair, considering I could just walk down to the sheriff's office right now. Rose watched the exchange with wide eyes, her hands clasped together at her chest. Vernon caught her gaze for a moment and gave her a slight nod, trying to convey that he wouldn't let Green cheat her. Green grumbled and cursed under his breath, but he went to his cash box and counted out the money. Vernon watched every bill and coin, then had Rose count it as well before she accepted it. Thank you, she whispered to Vernon as they stepped out of the shop together, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't intervened. That money is for my rent and food until I can find steady work. $40 would have lasted perhaps a month if I was careful. This gives me real time. Vernon studied her more carefully now that they were in better light. She had a gentle beauty, the kind that came from inner strength rather than mere physical features, though she was certainly pretty. Her face was heart-shaped with high cheekbones, and her full mouth was pressed into a line of worry despite her words of gratitude. She carried herself with dignity even though her circumstances were clearly strained. You're not from White Pine originally? Vernon asked. No, sir. I arrived 3 weeks ago from Illinois. My mother passed 6 months ago, and I've been trying to make ends meet ever since. I had no other family there, and I'd heard that Wyoming had opportunities for women willing to work hard. I've been staying at the boarding house, taking in laundry and mending, but it's not quite enough to cover expenses. Vernon nodded slowly. The story was common enough in frontier towns. Women alone had few options and many dangers. Where are you headed now? Back to the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson's place, about 2 miles west of town. Vernon glanced at the sun, which was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. 2 miles wasn't far, but the road between town and the scattered homesteads could be lonely and dangerous, especially for a woman alone carrying a substantial sum of money. "I'll walk with you," he said simply. Rose blinked in surprise. "Oh, that's not necessary. You've already done so much. It's not about necessity, Miss Langley. It's about what's right. You're carrying a good amount of cash, and there are folks who might notice that. Besides, I need to head that direction anyway to check on my horse at the livery near there." This was only partly true. Vernon's horse was indeed at a stable on the west side of the settlement, but he could have easily retrieved it and gone on his way. Something about Rose Langley pulled at him, though. Maybe it was the determined set of her jaw despite obvious hardship, or the way she'd stood up to Green even when she'd been uncertain. Or maybe it was simply that she reminded him of his own sister, back in Denver, who'd also had to make her own way in the world after their parents died. "Well, if you're certain it's not an imposition," Rose said softly, "I would appreciate the company, and please call me Rose." "Vernon," he replied, pleased that she'd accepted. "Let me just collect my things from my mule and we can be on our way." They walked back across the street to where Vernon's sturdy mule was laden with supplies he'd purchased after selling his pelts. He redistributed the weight slightly, then gestured for Rose to lead the way. She started down the main street, and he fell into step beside her, leading his mule with one hand. For a few minutes, they walked in companionable silence. The town was fairly quiet in the late afternoon heat, with most people seeking shade until evening. A few dogs lazed in the shadows, and somewhere a blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil in steady rhythm. "How long have you been trapping in these mountains?" Rose asked eventually, glancing up at him with curious eyes. "Near about 10 years now," Vernon replied. "Came out west when I was 18, worked various jobs until I found I preferred the solitude of the high country. There's something honest about matching yourself against nature. The mountain doesn't lie to you or cheat you. It's dangerous, but it's fair." Rose smiled slightly. "That sounds lonely, though." "Can be," Vernon admitted, "but it suits me. I come to town every few months for supplies and to trade my furs. That's enough human contact for me most times." He paused, then added, "Though I'll admit there's satisfaction in helping someone when the need arises." "You have my deepest gratitude," Rose said earnestly. "I don't know how I'll repay you for your kindness. No repayment needed. Just pass it forward when you're able to help someone else." They passed the last of the town's buildings and emerged onto a rutted wagon road that cut through scrubland dotted with sage and the occasional pine. The mountains rose up in the distance, purple and blue in the afternoon haze. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals. "What brought you specifically to White Pine?" Vernon asked. "It's pretty isolated, even for Wyoming." Rose adjusted her small reticule on her arm, and Vernon noticed how carefully she moved as though conserving energy. "I had heard there was a schoolteacher position that might become available. Mrs. Patterson mentioned it in the advertisement for her boarding house. But when I arrived, I learned the previous teacher had decided to stay on for another year. I've been trying to find other work since." "You're educated, then," Vernon observed. "My mother was a teacher back in Illinois, and she taught me well. I can read, write, cipher. I know history and geography. I'd hoped that would be enough to secure a position, but apparently experience is what they're looking for." Vernon heard the frustration in her voice and understood it. The frontier was full of contradictions. It offered opportunities unavailable back east, but it could also be ruthlessly practical. No one wanted to take a chance on an unproven teacher when children's education was at stake. What about working at one of the saloons? Vernon suggested, then quickly clarified at Rose's startled expression. Serving drinks and food, I mean. Some of them employ respectable women for that. It pays better than laundry work. Rose shook her head. Mrs. Patterson advised against it. She said the men can be too rough, and a woman's reputation is fragile enough out here without association with saloons. Vernon nodded, understanding the logic even if he disagreed with the narrow-mindedness of it. A woman had to guard her reputation fiercely in frontier towns, where gossip spread faster than wildfire and could destroy opportunities just as quickly. They walked on, and Vernon found himself studying Rose from the corner of his eye. She moved with grace despite the uneven road, and there was something resilient about her that appealed to him. Most women he'd met in towns like this were either hardened by life or wilted by it. Rose seemed to be neither. She bent under the weight of her circumstances but didn't break. "What will you do with the money?" Vernon asked. "Besides covering rent and food." "I'm hoping to save as much as possible," Rose replied. "If I can't find teaching work here, perhaps I could afford to travel to Cheyenne or even back to Denver. Larger cities might have more opportunities." Something twisted in Vernon's chest at the thought of her leaving, which was absurd. He'd just met her, but the feeling persisted nonetheless. "Denver's a good city," he said neutrally. "I have a sister there who works as a seamstress, makes a decent living." "Is she your only family?" "Only one still living. Parents died of cholera 7 years back. Margaret, my sister, she offered to let me stay with her, but I couldn't abide being cooped up in the city. That's when I took to the mountains full time." "I'm sorry about your parents," Rose said softly. "I know what it's like to lose your family. My father died when I was 16, and then my mother just earlier this year. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being orphaned, even as an adult." Vernon met her eyes and saw that she understood, truly understood, what he'd been through. It created an instant connection, this shared experience of loss. "It gets easier," he said gently. "Or maybe you just get used to carrying it, but yes, the loneliness is real." "Do you ever think about settling down?" Rose asked, then immediately looked flustered. "I'm sorry, that's too personal a question for someone I've just met." "No, it's all right," Vernon assured her. "I think about it sometimes, having a place to call home, someone to share it with. But I guess I've never met anyone who made me want to give up the mountains. And most women aren't too keen on the idea of living in a cabin miles from the nearest neighbor, dependent on hunting and trapping for survival." "I suppose that would be difficult," Rose agreed. "Though there's something romantic about the idea, too, being self-sufficient, relying on each other and the land." Vernon glanced at her sharply, surprised. "Most women find the idea terrifying." "I didn't say it wouldn't be scary," Rose said with a slight smile. "But fear and romance aren't mutually exclusive. The most worthwhile things in life often require courage." They were approaching a fork in the road now, and Rose gestured to the left path. "Mrs. Patterson's is just another mile up this way." Vernon noted that the path was even more isolated than the main road, winding through thicker stands of trees. His instincts, honed by years of watching for danger in the wilderness, prickled slightly. This was exactly the kind of place where someone might wait to ambush a traveler. As if summoned by his thoughts, 3 men emerged from the trees about 100 yards ahead. They spread out across the narrow road in a way that was clearly meant to block passage. Vernon's hand moved casually to rest on the knife at his belt. "Stay close to me," he murmured to Rose, who had already tensed beside him. "Vernon, it's all right," he said calmly. "Just stay close." As they continued forward, Vernon assessed the men with practiced eyes. The one in the middle was tall and thin, with a ratty beard and clothes that had seen too many days between washings. The man to his left was shorter but stocky, with a face marked by old scars. The third man was younger, maybe 20, with nervous eyes that kept darting between his companions and the approaching travelers. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Vernon called out when they were within speaking distance. He kept his voice pleasant but stopped walking, forcing the confrontation to happen on his terms rather than theirs. "Something I can help you with?" "Well now," the tall one said, revealing broken teeth when he grinned. "That depends. We heard tell that a certain young lady came into some money today. Thought maybe she'd like some protection on her journey home." "She's got protection," Vernon said flatly, "so you boys can move along." The stocky man laughed, a harsh sound. "1 against 3, mountain man. Those aren't good odds, even for someone your size." Vernon didn't move, but something in his stillness must have communicated danger because the young one took a half-step back. "I've faced down grizzly bears, mountain lions, and entire packs of wolves," Vernon said quietly. "The 3 of you don't concern me much, but I'd prefer not to hurt anyone today if it can be avoided. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to step aside and let us pass. Then you're going to forget you ever had this idea. And if we don't?" The tall one challenged, his hand moving to his gun. In one fluid motion that spoke of years of survival instincts, Vernon pulled his rifle from where it hung on his mule's saddle and leveled it at the tall man's chest. His movement was so fast and smooth that none of the 3 had time to clear their weapons. "Then you're going to find out just how good a shot a mountain man has to be to survive," Vernon said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel now. "And I'll tell you right now, at this distance, I don't miss." The standoff lasted for a long, tense moment. Rose had gone very still beside Vernon, one hand gripping his arm. He could feel her trembling slightly but also noticed that she hadn't screamed or panicked. She trusted him to handle this. The young man broke first, raising his hand slowly. "Come on, Jacob. It ain't worth getting shot over." The tall man, Jacob, glared at Vernon with pure hatred, but he could see the calculation in the man's eyes. 3 against 1 might seem like good odds when the one was unarmed and unsuspecting. But facing down a mountain man who already had them covered and clearly knew how to handle himself, that was suicide. "This ain't over," Jacob spat. "Yes, it is," Vernon corrected. "Because if I see any of you again, if I even hear that you've bothered anyone else on this road, I'll make it my personal mission to introduce you to the sheriff. And I'll testify about what happened here today. Attempted robbery is a hanging offense in Wyoming." The 3 men exchanged glances, then slowly moved off the road and melted back into the trees. Vernon kept his rifle up until they were well out of sight, his senses straining to make sure they weren't circling around for another attempt. "Are they gone?" Rose whispered. "I believe so. But we're going to move quickly from here, just in case." Vernon secured his rifle back in place and took Rose's elbow gently. "Can you run if you need to?" "Yes," she said, though her voice shook slightly. They moved forward at a brisk pace, and Vernon kept his attention split between the road ahead and the forest around them. His mule seemed undisturbed, which was a good sign. The animal had keen senses and would react to nearby humans. After about 10 minutes of fast walking, Rose let out a shaky breath. "That was terrifying." "You handled it well," Vernon said honestly. "You didn't panic, didn't make noise that might have escalated things. That took courage. I was gripping your arm so hard I probably left bruises." Vernon smiled slightly. "I didn't notice." They continued at a somewhat slower pace, and before long, a small farmhouse came into view around a bend. It was a tidy structure with a fenced yard and a vegetable garden that showed careful tending. Chickens pecked in the dirt, and a cow grazed in a nearby field. "That's Mrs. Patterson's," Rose said, relief evident in her voice. As they approached, the front door opened and a stout woman with gray hair and a no-nonsense expression stepped out. She took in the sight of Rose and Vernon with sharp eyes. "Rose Langley, who's this you've brought with you?" she called. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Vernon McAllister. He helped me in town and was kind enough to walk me home safely." Vernon removed his hat respectfully. "Madam, just wanted to make sure Miss Langley got back without trouble. The road can be dangerous." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "I know your name, Mr. McAllister. You're the trapper who brings furs through town regular. You have a good reputation for what that's worth. I appreciate you looking after my boarder." "It was my pleasure, madam." Rose turned to Vernon, and the gratitude in her eyes made something warm bloom in his chest. "Thank you, Vernon, for everything. I truly don't know what would have happened today if you hadn't been there." "You'd have figured something out," Vernon said sincerely. "You're stronger than you think, Rose Langley." A flush colored her cheeks at the compliment. "Will you be staying in town long?" "A few days, most likely. I need to resupply before heading back to my cabin." "Perhaps we'll see each other again before you leave." Vernon found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to. "I'd like that." Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat meaningfully, and Rose quickly stepped back, remembering propriety. "Safe travels, Vernon." "You too, Rose." He watched as she walked up the path to the house, Mrs. Patterson ushering her inside with the protectiveness of a mother hen. Just before the door closed, Rose looked back and gave him a small smile that made his heart do something strange in his chest. Vernon stood there for a long moment, then shook his head at himself and turned back toward town. He had things to do, supplies to gather, and a life in the mountains waiting for him. Getting entangled with a woman, no matter how appealing, was not part of his plan. But as he walked back toward White Pine, leading his mule and thinking about green eyes and auburn hair, Vernon had to admit that his plan might have just encountered a significant complication. The boarding house behind him grew smaller in the distance, but the memory of Rose's smile stayed with him the entire way back to town. Vernon found lodging for the night at a small hotel near the livery stable. It was nothing fancy, just a bed and 4 walls, but after weeks of sleeping on the ground or in his mountain cabin, it felt positively luxurious. He paid for 2 nights, figuring he'd need at least that long to gather what he needed and maybe, if he was honest with himself, to see Rose again. That evening, he sat in the hotel's small dining area, eating a meal of beef stew and bread while listening to the conversations around him. Frontier towns were gold mines of information if you knew how to listen, and Vernon had learned long ago that staying informed about local happenings could mean the difference between safety and danger. "Did you hear about Jim Fletcher's crew?" one man was saying to his companion. "3 of them got held up on the West Road yesterday, lost $50. Bandits getting bold," the other replied. "Sheriff needs to do something about it." Vernon ate his stew thoughtfully, wondering if the men who tried to accost him and Rose were the same ones mentioned. If so, they were becoming a real problem. He made a mental note to speak with the sheriff in the morning. After dinner, Vernon stepped outside to smoke his pipe and watch the town settle in for the night. The saloon across the street was doing brisk business, piano music and laughter spilling out into the darkness. A few riders passed by, and somewhere a dog barked. It was all so different from the quiet of his mountain cabin, where the only sounds were wind through the pines and the occasional call of an owl. He thought about what Rose had said earlier, about romance and courage. Most women he'd encountered had seen his lifestyle as something to be pitied or changed, not something that could be part of a shared life. But Rose had seemed genuinely interested, even curious about the possibilities. Not that it mattered, Vernon reminded himself firmly. She was looking for work, for stability. The last thing she needed was to get involved with a mountain man who spent most of his life in isolation. Still, he couldn't shake the image of her standing in his cabin, bringing warmth and life to the rough-hewn space. He went to bed that night with his thoughts full of green eyes and auburn hair. The next morning, Vernon made good on his intention to visit the sheriff. The office was a small building near the center of town, and Sheriff Thomas Morrison was a grizzled man in his 50s who'd seen enough of frontier life to be unflappable. "Mac Allister," Morrison greeted him. "What brings you to town besides the usual trading?" Vernon explained the incident on the road, describing the three men in detail. Morrison's expression grew progressively grimmer. "Jacob Hastings and his boys," the sheriff said with disgust. "They've been trouble for months, but I've never been able to catch them in the act. They're careful, usually only target folks who are too scared to report them or can't identify them properly. Your description helps. They mentioned that someone told them about Rose Langley coming into money," Vernon added. "Means someone in town is feeding them information." Morrison's eyes sharpened. "That's a serious accusation, but a logical one. How else would they know to wait on that particular road at that particular time?" The sheriff nodded slowly. "I'll look into it. In the meantime, you watch your back, Mac Allister. If Hastings thinks you're a threat to his operation, he might come after you directly." "I can handle myself," Vernon said simply. "But I'm concerned about Miss Langley. She's staying at Mrs. Patterson's place, and that road is dangerous." "I'll increase patrols in that area," Morrison promised. "And I'll have a talk with some of the local men about forming a watch group until we can get Hastings and his gang behind bars." Satisfied that he'd done what he could, Vernon left the sheriff's office and spent the rest of the morning gathering supplies. Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, and various other necessities that would last him through the coming months. He also found himself stopping at a small shop that sold fabric and notions. The proprietor, an elderly woman with kind eyes, helped him select a length of deep green wool that matched the color of Rose's eyes. "For a special lady?" she asked with a knowing smile. Vernon felt heat creep up his neck. "Just a thank-you gift for someone who showed me hospitality," he said, which was a complete lie since Rose hadn't actually hosted him, but it sounded better than admitting he was buying fabric for a woman he'd only just met. The woman wrapped the fabric in brown paper and tied it with string. "She's a lucky lady, whoever she is." By early afternoon, Vernon had collected all his purchases and loaded them onto his mule. He stood in the street, ostensibly checking the load distribution, but really trying to decide whether to head back to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house or just leave town and return to his mountains. The sensible thing would be to leave. He'd already stayed longer than usual, and autumn was approaching fast. He needed to prepare his cabin for winter, set his trap lines, and put up sufficient meat for the cold months. But sense seemed to have little bearing on his actions as he found himself turning his mule westward and heading down the now familiar road toward the boarding house. This time, the journey was peaceful. No ambushes, no trouble. Just the quiet of late afternoon and the sound of his own thoughts, which were entirely too focused on a certain auburn-haired woman. When he reached Mrs. Patterson's, he found Rose in the garden, hanging laundry on a line stretched between two posts. She wore a simple blue dress with the sleeves rolled up, and tendrils of hair had escaped her bun to curl around her face in the humidity. She looked up at the sound of his approach and broke into a smile that made the entire 2-mile walk worthwhile. "Vernon, I didn't expect to see you again so soon." He dismounted and tied his mule to the fence post, suddenly uncertain how to explain his presence. "I was heading back to my cabin and thought I'd check that you made it through the night without trouble." "That's very kind of you. We were perfectly safe." Mrs. Patterson locks up tight after dark. Vernon pulled the wrapped package from his saddlebag, feeling more awkward than he had in years. "I also wanted to give you this, as a thank you for the company yesterday." Rose wiped her hands on her apron and approached, curiosity lighting her features. She took the package carefully and untied the string, letting the paper fall away to reveal the green wool. Her breath caught. "Vernon, this is beautiful, but it's far too expensive. It's not charity," he said quickly. "I wanted you to have something practical. Winter comes hard in Wyoming, and a good wool dress or cloak will serve you well." Rose looked up at him, and her eyes were suddenly bright with tears. "You barely know me, and yet you've shown me more kindness in 2 days than I've encountered in months. Why?" Vernon considered the question seriously. "Because kindness shouldn't be rationed based on acquaintance. Because you're a good person in a hard situation. And because," he paused, surprised by his own honesty, "because from the moment I saw you standing up to that cheat of a merchant, I admired your courage. You deserved help, and I was in a position to give it." A tear slipped down Rose's cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." Mrs. Patterson appeared on the porch at that moment, saving them both from the intensity of the moment. "Mr. McAllister, would you care to stay for supper? It's the least we can offer for your kindness to Rose." Vernon knew he should decline. Knew that accepting would mean further entanglement, more reasons to think about Rose when he should be focused on survival and solitude. "I'd be honored, madam," he heard himself say. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house had 3 other residents besides Rose. An elderly couple named the Hendersons who'd come west to be near their son, and a young widow named Sarah who worked at the general store. They all gathered around the large dining table that evening, and Vernon found himself the center of attention as they peppered him with questions about life in the mountains. He answered as best he could, describing the beauty of alpine meadows in summer, the challenge of winter storms, the satisfaction of living by one's own skills and strength. Rose listened intently, her eyes never leaving his face as he spoke. "Don't you get lonely?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "All that time alone?" Vernon glanced at Rose before answering. "Sometimes. But there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. I've been alone and content. I've also been in crowded places and felt profoundly lonely. It's not always about the number of people around you." "Wise words," Mr. Henderson said with approval. "Though I'll say, having my Martha beside me these 40 years has made even the hard times bearable." Mrs. Henderson patted her husband's hand fondly, and Vernon felt a pang of something that might have been longing. He'd never given much thought to marriage or companionship beyond the abstract. His life didn't lend itself to relationships. But watching the casual affection between the elderly couple, seeing the warmth in Rose's eyes as she looked at him, Vernon found himself wondering what he might be missing. After supper, Rose walked with him to where his mule was tied. The sun had set, leaving the sky streaked with purple and gold. Crickets chirped in the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. "When will you come back to town?" Rose asked softly. "Hard to say. Depends on weather, how the trapping goes, how quickly I go through supplies. Could be a few weeks, could be a few months." She looked down at her hands. "I see." Vernon reached out and gently tilted her chin up until she met his eyes. "But I'll come back, Rose, I promise you that." "Why?" she whispered. "You could have any woman you wanted. Why show such interest in me?" "Because you're brave and honest and kind. Because when I look at you, I see someone who faces hardship with grace. Because," He paused, searching for words to express the feeling that had been growing in his chest since yesterday. Because in 2 days, you've made me question choices I've never doubted before. Rose's eyes widened. Vernon, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I know my life isn't one most women would want. Long months in isolation, hard work, danger from weather and wildlife. I'm not asking you to consider it. I'm just being honest about what I'm feeling. And what are you feeling? Rose asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vernon took a deep breath. This kind of vulnerability was harder than facing down a charging grizzly. I'm feeling like maybe being alone isn't the same as being free. I'm feeling like I want to know you better, spend more time with you. I'm feeling like you've awakened something in me that I thought was long dead. Rose reached up and placed her hand against his chest, right over his heart. I feel it too, she admitted. From the moment you stepped in to help me, I felt drawn to you. You make me feel safe and seen in a way I haven't felt since my parents died. But Vernon, I don't know anything about the life you lead. I've never even been camping, let alone lived in the wilderness. Then let me teach you, he said impulsively. Not right now, not today. But when I come back to town, if you're still here and still interested, let me show you what that life could be like. Then you can make an informed decision about whether it's something you could ever want. You do that. Take time to show me your world. Rose, right now I'd do just about anything to spend more time with you. She smiled, and even in the gathering darkness it was like sunshine. Then I'll wait for you, Vernon McAllister, however long it takes. He wanted to kiss her. The urge was almost overwhelming. But it was too soon, too fast, and he respected her too much to rush. Instead, he took her hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Stay safe, he murmured. You too. The mountains can be dangerous. The mountains I can handle. It's leaving you that's proving difficult. They stood there for a long moment, hands clasped, neither wanting to be the first to let go. Finally, Vernon forced himself to step back and untie his mule. Until next time, he said. Until next time, Rose echoed. Vernon rode away into the darkness, but he looked back 3 times, and each time he could see Rose's silhouette still standing there, watching him go. The ride back to his cabin took 2 days of steady travel through increasingly rugged terrain. Vernon's home was situated in a small valley high in the mountains, protected from the worst winds by rocky cliffs and surrounded by dense pine forests. He'd built the cabin himself 5 years ago, choosing the location for its access to water, game, and trap lines. As he approached and saw the sturdy log structure with its stone chimney and covered porch, Vernon tried to see it through Rose's eyes. It was rough, certainly. One room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom with a small loft for storage. An outhouse 50 yards away, a creek another 100 yards beyond that. The nearest neighbor was a day's ride away. Most women would take one look and run screaming back to civilization. But Rose wasn't most women, was she? She'd faced down poverty, loss, cross-country travel alone, and attempted robbery, all with remarkable courage. Maybe, just maybe, she could learn to love this life the way he did. Vernon spent the next weeks in a flurry of activity. He checked and repaired his trap lines, hunted elk and deer to stock his larder for winter, cut and stacked firewood until his hands were raw despite their calluses. And through all of it, he thought about Rose. He wondered what she was doing, whether she'd found work, whether she thought of him as often as he thought of her. He found himself imagining her in his cabin, bringing softness to the rough edges. Her laughter filling the silence, her presence warming the space in ways no fire could. It was a dangerous line of thinking for a man who'd prided himself on self-sufficiency. 6 weeks after leaving White Pine, Vernon made his way back to town with a load of furs to trade. His heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the exertion of the journey. He went first to the trading post, exchanging his furs for credit and cash. Then he cleaned up as best he could at the hotel's bathhouse, trimmed his beard, and changed into his cleanest shirt. He felt like a fool, primping like a schoolboy, but he couldn't help himself. The ride out to Mrs. Patterson's felt both too long and too short. What if Rose had left? What if she'd found work elsewhere or decided frontier life wasn't for her? What if she'd met someone else, someone who could offer her stability and comfort? But when he arrived, there she was again in the garden, this time harvesting vegetables into a basket. She looked up at the sound of his approach, and the smile that lit her face banished every doubt from his mind. Vernon. She set down her basket and hurried to the fence, propriety forgotten in her obvious joy at seeing him. "You came back." "I promised I would," he said, dismounting. "Did you doubt me?" "Maybe a little," she admitted. 6 weeks is a long time. It felt longer to me. "Rose, I thought about you every single day." She blushed prettily. "I thought about you too. Mrs. Patterson started teasing me about being distracted." Vernon grinned. "Is she still willing to feed me if I show up at supper time?" I'm sure she could be convinced. They stood there smiling at each other like fools until Mrs. Patterson herself appeared on the porch. "Vernon McAllister, don't just stand there gawking. Come inside. Rose, you need to finish those vegetables before it gets dark." Over supper, Vernon learned that Rose had indeed found more steady work. She was now teaching 3 children from nearby homesteads who came to Mrs. Patterson's 3 days a week for lessons. It wasn't a full school position, but it was a start, and it paid better than laundry work. "The parents were impressed by my credentials," Rose explained. "And Mrs. Patterson vouched for my character. It's not much, but it's what I love doing." "That's wonderful," Vernon said sincerely. "You're a natural teacher, I can tell by the way you explain things." After supper, they walked together in the gloaming, staying within sight of the house, but having enough privacy to talk freely. "I meant what I said before," Vernon began, "about showing you my world, helping you understand what that life would be like." Rose looked up at him, moonlight catching in her hair. "And I meant what I said about wanting to see it. But Vernon, how would that work? I can't just disappear into the mountains with you. My reputation would be protected," Vernon assured her. "I've thought about this. Mrs. Patterson could chaperone. We could make a trip of it, maybe 3 or 4 days. I have a friend, another trapper named Bill Hutchinson, who lives about half a day's ride from my cabin. His wife Mary could join us too. It would all be proper." Rose bit her lip, considering. "You've really thought this through?" "I have, because I want you to have all the information before you make any decisions about us, about whether there could be an us." "Is that what you want? An us?" Vernon took both her hands in his. "Rose, I'm not a man who speaks carelessly or acts on whim. These past 6 weeks have been torture. I've been alone in those mountains for years and been perfectly content. But now, suddenly, the cabin feels empty. The silence feels oppressive instead of peaceful. You've changed something fundamental in me, and I need to know if there's any possibility that you could feel the same way." "I already do feel the same way," Rose said softly. "Vernon, I've been drawn to you from the first moment. You're honorable and strong and kind. You make me feel things I've never felt before. But I'm scared of making a mistake, scared of giving up what little security I've managed to find, scared of disappointing you if I can't adapt to that life." "Then let's find out together," Vernon urged. "Come with me into the mountains. See my world, meet my friends, learn the skills you'd need, and if at the end of it you decide it's not for you, I'll accept that, but at least we'll know for certain." Rose looked up at the stars scattered across the Wyoming sky, then back at Vernon. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. "Let's do it. When?" "I need to talk to Bill and Mary, make sure they are agreeable to hosting visitors. And we need to convince Mrs. Patterson to accompany us. But if everything works out, maybe in a week or two." "A week or two," Rose repeated, and Vernon couldn't tell if she was excited or terrified. Probably both. Mrs. Patterson took some convincing, but she eventually agreed to chaperone the expedition, especially after Vernon explained that Mary Hutchinson would also be there. "I suppose I could use a change of scenery," the older woman admitted. "And I trust you to behave honorably, Mr. McAllister." The next 10 days were a whirlwind of preparation. Vernon made the trip to Bill and Mary's place to explain the situation. Bill, a wiry man in his 40s who'd trapped these mountains even longer than Vernon, thought the whole thing was hilarious. "You, getting sweet on a town girl," he laughed. "Never thought I'd see the day." "She's different," Vernon insisted. "She's got courage and curiosity. I think she could adapt." Mary, a practical woman who'd followed Bill into the wilderness 20 years ago and never looked back, was more thoughtful. "It's a hard life, Vernon. Make sure she really understands what she'd be giving up." "That's the point of this trip," Vernon replied. "I don't want her to make promises she can't keep or commit to something she doesn't fully understand." On the appointed day, Vernon arrived at Mrs. Patterson's with 2 additional horses and enough supplies for the journey. Rose emerged wearing a split riding skirt she'd made from the green wool he'd given her, and Vernon had to take a moment to catch his breath. She looked beautiful and practical and utterly right. The journey into the mountains took most of the day. Vernon led them on trails that only someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain could navigate. Rose proved to be a capable rider, and she gazed around at the scenery with wonder rather than fear. "It's beautiful," she breathed as they climbed higher and the views expanded. "I've never seen anything like it." "Wait until you see the valley where my cabin is," Vernon promised. "It's even better." They stopped at Bill and Mary's place for the first night. The Hutchinsons' cabin was larger than Vernon's, with 2 rooms and a proper barn for their animals. Mary welcomed them warmly, and over a dinner of venison stew and biscuits, the 2 women talked while the men saw to the horses. "Is she serious about this?" Bill asked Vernon. "About possibly taking up this life?" "I think so. But she's smart enough to want to see what it really entails before making promises." "That's wise. Mary was the same way. Made me prove I could provide for her before she'd agree to marry me. Best decision either of us ever made." The next morning, they rode to Vernon's cabin. He watched Rose's face carefully as it came into view, trying to gauge her reaction. She took in the solid log construction, the neat appearance despite its isolation, the spectacular view of the valley stretching out below. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "Every log," Vernon confirmed. "Took me 6 months, working from dawn to dusk." Inside, Rose moved around the single room, taking in the details. The bed with its thick fur coverlet, the stone fireplace, the rough-hewn table and chairs, the shelves lined with supplies. It was Spartan but clean and well organized. "It's smaller than I expected," Rose said honestly, "but it feels solid, safe." "It's weathered some harsh winters," Vernon told her. "The walls are thick, and that fireplace can heat the whole space even when it's below 0 outside." Mrs. Patterson had insisted on propriety. So Rose and she stayed in Bill and Mary's cabin while Vernon remained in his own place. But during the days, Vernon showed Rose everything about his life. He taught her to identify animal tracks, to move quietly through the forest, to fish in the creek. She proved to be a quick learner, asking thoughtful questions and not complaining even when the work was hard. He showed her how to skin a rabbit, and though she turned pale, she didn't flinch away. "If I'm going to eat meat, I should understand where it comes from," she said firmly. Mary spent time with Rose too, explaining the realities of frontier life for women. How to preserve food for winter, how to make soap and candles, how to treat minor injuries with herbs and common sense. Rose absorbed it all like a sponge. On the third evening, Vernon and Rose sat together on a fallen log near his cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. Mrs. Patterson was back at the Hutchinsons' place with Mary, giving them a rare moment of privacy within shouting distance, but not within hearing range. "So," Vernon said carefully, "what do you think? Honestly." Rose was quiet for a long moment. "I think it's beautiful and terrifying and more work than I imagined. I think I'd miss other people, miss conversation and variety and easy access to books and supplies." Vernon's heart sank. "I understand, but," Rose continued, turning to face him, "I also think I could learn to love it, because the work has meaning here. Everything you do serves a purpose. There's honor in that kind of self-sufficiency. And the beauty, Vernon, the sheer beauty of this place takes my breath away. I could wake up to views like this every morning and never tire of them." "It's not always beautiful," Vernon warned. "Winter is brutal. There are weeks when the snow is so deep you can't go anywhere, when all you can do is stay inside and wait for a break in the weather. There are dangerous animals, sudden storms, accidents that can happen when you're miles from help." "I know," Rose said. Mary explained all of that very clearly. She didn't sugarcoat anything. "But Vernon, what you're offering is partnership. A chance to build something real with someone who sees me as an equal, not just as a housekeeper or a decoration. That's worth facing some hardship for." Vernon took her hands, his heart pounding. "Rose, I need to be absolutely clear about something. I'm not offering you a temporary arrangement or a casual courtship. If you say yes to this life, I'm asking you to marry me, to become my wife, my partner in every sense. I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a short time, but I've never been more certain of anything." Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Vernon McAllister, are you proposing to me?" "I am. I'm proposing that you take a chance on a mountain man who's rough around the edges but who will love you with everything he has. Who will protect you and provide for you and cherish you every day of his life. Who will build you a bigger cabin if this one's too small. Who will take you to town as often as you need. Who will do whatever it takes to make you happy." "Yes," Rose whispered. "Yes, Vernon, I'll marry you." Vernon let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and pulled Rose into his arms. She came willingly, fitting against his broad chest as if she'd been made to be there. He tilted her face up and kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper as she responded with equal passion. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vernon rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Rose Langley. I know it's soon, but I've never been more sure of anything." "I love you too," Rose said, wonder in her voice. "I didn't know I could feel this way about someone." "You've awakened my heart, Vernon." They sat together in the gathering darkness, making plans and dreaming about their future. Vernon explained that they'd need to go back to White Pine to get married properly, with witnesses and legal documentation. Rose wanted Mrs. Patterson there, and Vernon thought they should invite the Hutchinsons too. "And then we'll come back here?" Rose asked. "If you're sure," Vernon said. "I meant what I said about building a bigger cabin if you need it." Rose looked at the small structure that would become her home. "Maybe eventually. But for now, I think we can make this work. It'll be cozy." "That's one word for it," Vernon said with a smile. The next morning, they shared their news with the others. Mrs. Patterson had tears in her eyes as she hugged Rose. "I worried you'd end up alone, my dear." "I'm so glad I was wrong." Mary Hutchinson embraced Rose warmly. Welcome to the Sisterhood of Mountain Wives. It's a small group, but we look after each other. Bill clapped Vernon on the shoulder. You're a lucky man, McAllister. Don't I know it? Vernon replied, watching Rose laugh at something Mary said. They rode back to White Pine the next day, and Vernon immediately went to speak with the circuit preacher, a traveling minister who came through the area once a month. Luck was with them. The preacher was in town and agreed to perform the ceremony in 3 days' time, giving them time to make basic preparations. Rose and Mrs. Patterson worked together to alter Rose's best dress, adding lace that Mrs. Patterson had been saving for years. Vernon bought a new shirt and had his one suit cleaned and pressed. It wasn't fancy, but it would be proper. The wedding took place in the small church on a sunny October morning. Besides the Hutchinsons and Mrs. Patterson, several townspeople attended, curious about the mountain man taking a bride. Sheriff Morrison was there, having formed a respect for Vernon after their work together to apprehend Jacob Hastings and his gang, who'd been caught attempting another robbery and were awaiting trial. Rose walked down the aisle without a father to give her away, but she held her head high, and her eyes never left Vernon's face. He stood at the altar in his suit, feeling constricted by the formal clothes but willing to endure any discomfort for this moment. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the preacher asked if Vernon would take Rose to be his lawfully wedded wife, his "I will" rang out strong and clear. Rose's voice shook slightly with emotion when she made her vows, but her commitment was unmistakable. Vernon slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, one he'd commissioned from the town's blacksmith. It wasn't elaborate, but it was solid and real, like their love. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced, and Vernon did thoroughly, to the amusement of the assembled guests. The wedding breakfast at the hotel's dining room was a lively affair. The Hendersons from Mrs. Patterson's boarding house had traveled into town for the occasion, and even some of Vernon's fellow trappers showed up to wish them well. "Never thought I'd see Vernon McAllister domesticated," one of them joked. "I'm not domesticated," Vernon retorted good-naturedly. "I'm just choosing to share my life with someone who makes it better." Rose blushed at the compliment but squeezed his hand under the table. As afternoon approached, Vernon and Rose said their goodbyes. Mrs. Patterson hugged Rose tightly. "You come visit when you can, you hear. And if it gets to be too much, if you need help or just someone to talk to, you send word." "I will," Rose promised. "Thank you for everything. For taking me in, for believing in me, for being the mother I needed when mine was gone." There wasn't a dry eye among the women as Vernon helped Rose onto her horse. They'd loaded a pack animal with her possessions, which weren't many, and additional supplies for the winter ahead. The ride back to the cabin took 2 days, but this time it felt different. This time, Rose wasn't a visitor trying to decide. She was going home. When they reached the cabin at sunset on the second day, Vernon dismounted and then lifted Rose down from her horse. Instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her to the door. "What are you doing?" Rose laughed. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," Vernon said. "It's tradition, isn't it?" He kicked open the door and carried her inside, setting her down gently in front of the fireplace. The cabin was cold, having been empty for days, but Vernon quickly got a fire going. Soon warmth was spreading through the space, and Rose began unpacking their supplies. That night, they consummated their marriage on the bed with its fur coverlet, and Vernon was gentle and patient with Rose, who came to him as innocent as she was eager. Afterward, they lay together, skin to skin, watching firelight dance on the ceiling. "Are you happy?" Vernon asked softly. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Rose replied. "I feel like I've finally found where I belong." Vernon kissed her temple. "You belong with me, always." The weeks that followed were an adjustment for both of them. Rose learned to cook on the fireplace, to manage their limited water supply, to keep the cabin clean and organized in the small space. Vernon taught her to shoot, insisting she needed to know how to defend herself when he was out checking traps. She proved to be a decent shot after some practice. "My father taught me to shoot when I was young," she explained. "I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed it." As autumn deepened into winter, they settled into a rhythm. Vernon would check his trap lines every few days, never staying away longer than necessary. Rose kept the home fires burning, literally and figuratively. She organized Vernon's haphazard supply system, mended his clothes, and brought little touches of civilization to the rough cabin. She'd brought her small collection of books, and in the evenings, they would read aloud to each other by firelight. Vernon discovered he loved the sound of her voice bringing stories to life. Rose discovered she loved the security of Vernon's presence, his strength and steadiness making her feel safe even in the wilderness. The first major snowstorm hit in late November. Vernon had warned Rose it was coming, reading the signs in the sky and the behavior of animals. They prepared carefully, bringing in extra firewood, double-checking their food supplies, making sure everything they might need was close at hand. For 3 days, the wind howled and snow piled up past the windows. Rose experienced moments of claustrophobia, of fear at the sheer power of nature bearing down on their small shelter. But Vernon remained calm, keeping the fire going, telling her stories, making love to her to pass the long hours. When the storm finally broke and they emerged to find the world transformed into a pristine white wonderland, Rose felt a sense of accomplishment. She'd survived her first real test as a mountain wife. "You did well," Vernon told her, pride evident in his voice. "Some women panic during storms like that, but you kept your head." "I was terrified," Rose admitted, "but I trusted you, trusted that you'd keep us safe." "Always," Vernon promised. "That's my job now, keeping you safe and happy." December brought more snow but also moments of incredible beauty. Vernon took Rose snowshoeing, teaching her how to move across the deep snow. They saw elk in the distance, their breath steaming in the cold air. They watched eagles soar overhead, looking for prey. For Christmas, Vernon gave Rose a rocking chair he'd spent weeks secretly crafting in Bill Hutchinson's barn during his visits there. Rose gave Vernon a new shirt she'd sewn, using fabric she'd carefully hoarded from her trousseau. "It's perfect," Vernon said, examining the careful stitching. "You've got real skill." "My mother taught me," Rose said. "She said every woman should know how to sew well, that it was a practical skill that would always serve her." They spent Christmas Day in the cabin, cooking a special meal of venison roast and the last of the potatoes and talking about their future. Rose confessed she hoped for children someday, but not immediately. She wanted time to fully adapt to mountain life first. Vernon agreed. "There's no rush. We have all the time in the world." January and February were the hardest months. The cold was relentless, and cabin fever was a real threat, but Vernon had prepared well, and they had plenty of supplies. Rose started teaching Vernon to read better, his education having been limited by frontier circumstances. Vernon taught Rose to play chess using a set he'd carved himself. In March, the first signs of spring appeared. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of brown earth. Birds returned from their southern migrations. The creek, frozen solid for months, began to thaw and flow again. Vernon and Rose emerged from their winter cocoon like butterflies, blinking in the strengthening sunlight and breathing air that held the promise of warmth. They'd made it through their first winter together, and their bond was stronger for it. In April, they made their first trip to White Pine since the wedding. Rose was excited to see Mrs. Patterson and show off how well she'd adapted to mountain life. Vernon needed to replenish supplies and sell the furs he'd accumulated over winter. Mrs. Patterson was delighted to see them both looking healthy and happy. "I worried about you all winter," she admitted. "But I can see my worry was wasted. You're practically glowing, Rose." Rose laughed. "Mountain air agrees with me, apparently, and having Vernon for company helps tremendously." They stayed in White Pine for 3 days, and Rose was surprised to find she was eager to return to the cabin. The town felt crowded and noisy after months of peaceful isolation. "Is it strange that I miss our cabin?" she asked Vernon as they prepared to leave. "Not strange at all," Vernon assured her. "It's home now. That's how you know you've truly adapted. Summer in the mountains was glorious." The high meadows burst into bloom with wildflowers, and the weather was mild and pleasant. Vernon taught Rose to fish properly, and she delighted in catching trout from the creek. They hiked to hidden valleys and mountain lakes, Vernon sharing his intimate knowledge of the land. In July, Rose realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another month to be sure before telling Vernon, afraid to hope too much. But when August came with no sign of bleeding, she knew. "Vernon," she said one evening as they sat outside watching the sunset, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her, immediately attentive to the serious tone in her voice. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm more than all right," Rose said, smiling through tears. "I'm expecting a baby." Vernon's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, joy, fear, and then an overwhelming tenderness. He pulled Rose into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass. "A baby," he breathed. "Rose, are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor's confirmation." "But all the signs are there." Vernon pulled back to look at her face. "How do you feel about it? I know you wanted to wait." "I did want to wait," Rose admitted. "But now that it's happening, I'm happy. Scared, but happy. We'll figure it out together." "We need to talk to Mary Hutchinson," Vernon said, his practical side taking over. "She's helped deliver babies before, and we should plan to be closer to White Pine when your time comes, in case you need a doctor." The next day, they rode to the Hutchinsons' place. Mary was indeed experienced with childbirth, having helped several women in the area over the years. She examined Rose carefully and confirmed the pregnancy. "You look healthy," Mary said. "That's good. Keep doing what you're doing, eating well, staying active but not overexerting. Come see me once a month so I can check on you." As autumn approached again, Vernon worked harder than ever to prepare for winter. This time, they wouldn't just be caring for themselves. They'd have a baby to protect. "We should think about adding another room to the cabin," Vernon said one evening. "The baby will need space, and you'll want some privacy." "Let's wait until spring," Rose suggested. "I don't want you trying to do construction when you should be preparing for winter." "We can manage in one room for now. Babies are small." Vernon reluctantly agreed, though he started collecting and preparing logs for the addition anyway, working whenever he had spare time. In December, as snow began to fall again, Rose's belly had grown round and firm. She felt the baby move inside her, flutter kicks that made her laugh and cry at the same time. Vernon loved to put his hand on her stomach and feel their child moving. "Boy or girl?" he asked one night. "I don't know," Rose said. "Do you have a preference?" "Healthy," Vernon said firmly. "That's all I care about. Healthy baby, healthy wife." Rose went into labor on a cold February morning. Vernon had been checking his traps but returned early when he felt uneasy, trusting the instinct that had kept him alive for years. He found Rose gripping the table, her face pale and sweating. "The baby," she gasped. "It's coming." Vernon's heart nearly stopped. They'd planned for Rose to go stay with the Hutchinsons a week before her due date, but the baby had decided to come early. The weather was too dangerous to risk the journey now. He'd helped deliver foals and calves, had even assisted once when a trapper's wife gave birth during a hunting expedition. He could do this. He had to do this. Vernon got Rose settled on the bed, boiled water, gathered clean cloths, and talked to her in a calm, steady voice, even though inside he was terrified. The labor went on for hours, and several times Vernon nearly decided to risk the journey to the Hutchinsons, but Rose insisted she couldn't make the trip. Finally, as evening shadows lengthened, their son was born. Vernon caught the baby in his large, capable hands, clearing the infant's mouth and nose until he let out a lusty wail. Rose, exhausted and tear-streaked, reached for her child. "A boy," Vernon said, his voice rough with emotion. "We have a son, Rose." He placed the baby in Rose's arms and took care of the afterbirth, then cleaned them both up as best he could. The baby was small but perfect, with a shock of dark hair and Vernon's gray eyes. "What should we name him?" Rose asked, stroking their son's soft cheek. Vernon thought for a moment. "Thomas Vernon McAllister, after your father and me." Rose's eyes filled with tears. "That's perfect. Hello, Thomas. Welcome to our family." The weeks after Thomas's birth were exhausting but joyful. Vernon took over most of the household tasks, insisting Rose rest and recover. He proved to be surprisingly gentle with the baby, his large hands tender as he changed diapers and rocked Thomas to sleep. When spring came and travel was possible again, they made the journey to show off their son. Mrs. Patterson cried at the sight of the baby, and Mary Hutchinson examined both mother and child with approval. "You did well, Vernon," Mary said. "Some men panic during childbirth, but you kept your head." "Wasn't much choice," Vernon replied, "but I hope I never have to do it again." "Next time, Rose, you're staying with Mary a full month before your due date." Rose laughed. "I'll agree to that. Though I have to say, there was something right about Thomas being born in our cabin in the home we'd built together. As Thomas grew, the cabin became too small for comfort." True to his word, Vernon spent the summer building an addition. With help from Bill Hutchinson and several other local trappers, he added a bedroom and expanded the main living space. Rose created a cozy nursery corner in the new bedroom, using fabric to make curtains and padding a cradle that Vernon built. The cabin was no longer Spartan. It was a home, filled with the warmth of family. Thomas was 6 months old when Rose discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the announcement was met with equal joy but more preparation. Vernon insisted Rose go stay with Mary a month before the due date, and this time she agreed without argument. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret after Vernon's sister, was born in the Hutchinsons' cabin with Mary as midwife. The birth was easier than Thomas's had been, and little Margaret was a calm baby from the start. "Now we're complete," Rose said, holding Margaret while Thomas toddled around under Vernon's watchful eye. "2 healthy children, a home we built ourselves, and more love than I ever dreamed possible." Vernon sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted. "A family, a real home. I thought I was meant to live alone, but you changed everything, Rose. You and these children are my whole world now." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and milestones. Thomas learned to hunt and trap alongside his father, growing strong and capable in the mountain wilderness. Margaret proved to have her mother's love of learning, and Rose taught both children to read and write using the books she'd brought from Illinois and others they acquired on trips to town. Vernon built a second addition to the cabin when the children got older and needed separate rooms. The small mountain homestead grew and prospered. They raised chickens for eggs and kept a milk cow. Rose planted a vegetable garden that provided fresh produce in summer and preserves for winter. They weren't wealthy by any measure, but they were rich in the things that mattered: love, family, health, and the satisfaction of building a life through their own hard work and dedication. When Thomas was 10 and Margaret 8, Vernon took them on their first extended trapping expedition. Rose worried, but she knew this was important. Her children needed to understand the land that sustained them, to respect, and know how to survive in the wilderness. They returned after a week, all three wind-burnt and tired, but with stories that would be told around the fire for years. Margaret had tracked a deer by herself and gotten close enough to touch it before it spooked. Thomas had set his first successful trap line. "They're good kids," Vernon told Rose that night as they lay in bed. "Strong and smart and kind. We did well." "We did," Rose agreed, contentment in her voice. "Sometimes I think about the girl I was, standing in that merchant's shop, scared and alone and being cheated. If someone had told me that my life would turn out like this, I never would have believed them." "I'm glad I walked into that shop," Vernon said. "Best decision I ever made, deciding to help you." "Best thing that ever happened to me," Rose replied, kissing him softly. "You saved me, Vernon, in every way a person can be saved." "No," Vernon corrected gently. "We saved each other." As the children grew into teenagers and then young adults, the cabin saw additions and changes. Thomas built his own small cabin nearby when he married a girl from White Pine, a carpenter's daughter named Emma, who loved the mountains as much as he did. Margaret, following in her mother's footsteps, became a teacher. She took a position at the school in White Pine but visited often, bringing books and news from town. Vernon and Rose grew older together, their hair graying and their bodies showing the wear of hard living. But their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, deepened by shared experiences and mutual respect. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they sat together on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Thomas and Emma's children played in the yard, their laughter ringing through the valley. 20 years, Rose marveled. "It feels like yesterday and forever all at once." Vernon took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Best 20 years of my life." "I love you, Rose McAllister, more today than the day we married." "And I love you," Rose replied. "My mountain man who saw a woman in need and chose to help, who made everything right and walked me safely home, who became my home." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their grandchildren play and feeling the satisfaction of a life well lived. The mountains rose around them, eternal and unchanging, bearing witness to the love story that had unfolded in their shadow. The merchant who had tried to cheat Rose was long gone from White Pine, his dishonest business eventually causing his downfall. But his attempted fraud had inadvertently led to something beautiful. It had brought Vernon and Rose together, setting in motion a chain of events that created a family, a legacy, and a love that would endure long after they were gone. As darkness fell and stars began to emerge in the vast Wyoming sky, Vernon helped Rose to her feet. They walked inside together, still hand in hand after all these years, and closed the door on another perfect day in their mountain home. Their story had begun with an act of kindness from a stranger who became the love of her life. It continued in the laughter of grandchildren, the strength of the home they'd built, and the unshakable bond between two people who had chosen each other against all odds and created something extraordinary from that choice. And in the mountains of Wyoming, in a valley where pine trees whispered ancient secrets and eagles soared on thermal winds, their love story became legend. The mountain man and his bride, proof that sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most profound destinies, and that true love can flourish anywhere, even in the rugged wilderness of the Wild West. Years later, when Vernon was in his 60s and Rose in her early 50s, they would sit with their grandchildren and tell the story of how they met. The children never tired of hearing about the merchant who tried to cheat Grandma Rose, and how Grandpa Vernon had stepped in to make things right. And then, the children would prompt eagerly, "What happened next?" "Then," Rose would say, her eyes finding Vernon's across the room and sharing a smile that held decades of love and partnership, "he walked me safely home, and I've been home ever since." Vernon would nod, his weathered face creasing in a smile. "Best walk I ever took." And in those moments, surrounded by family in the cabin they'd built together, with a lifetime of memories behind them and the love of their lives beside them, both Vernon and Rose knew with absolute certainty that every choice they'd made, every hardship they'd endured, every moment of doubt they'd overcome had been worth it. Their love story, born from an act of kindness in a dusty frontier town, had blossomed into something beautiful and lasting. It was a testament to the power of courage, compassion, and the simple decision to help a stranger in need. And so their story ended not with grand drama or sweeping gestures, but with something better. A life well lived, a love well earned, and a family that would carry their legacy forward into future generations. In the end, that was the greatest happy ending of all.